In late 2019, HBO debuted a Watchmen limited event series, based on the popular comic book by Alan Moore. It was met with some polarization, to say the least. Those who loved the show praised it as a bold step in weaving a postmodern superhero story better suited for the current age. Those who hated the show generally believed it was a tarnishing of the original intent of the comic book. This is usually a common complaint among any remake, really. In fact, this is pretty much a default position. You just take one look at the trailer, and before you've even seen the movie or TV show in question, you immediately remark, "That's nothing like the movie or show or comic book I knew. Why do they have to ruin it?" But that's too easy a statement to make, and also pretty lazy if you don't even bother to look into the media itself. And so I decided to take a dive into Watchmen as a whole to gain a full sense of the legacy that those have felt was either respected or disrespected. Let's take a look at everything Watchmen. Watchmen was a 1986 to 1987 comic book series written by Alan Moore with illustrations by Dave Gibbons. Moore's original idea for this story was to be a deconstruction of DC Comics superheroes, notably the characters that were recently acquired from Carlton Comics. But since DC wanted to place these characters in more stories, Moore was eventually talked out of utilizing already established characters by editing manager Dick Giordano. Moore eventually warmed up to the idea as long as the grander goal of post-modernism and superhero convention satire was present, even if it had to be through original substitutes. Alan Moore thought this would be easier to get across with already established characters, but realized that DC Comics probably wouldn't let him do such a thing, as the company knew that these characters would either wind up dead or dysfunctional if they were under Alan Moore's writing. The story depicts an alternate 1985, where superheroes have reshaped the world. A golden age of heroes has come to a close after the Keene Act strictly outlawed and demonized vigilantism. Richard Nixon is still president after term limits were changed, and the Watergate scandal never occurred. The war in Vietnam was won thanks to the intervention of superheroes. But the most reflective story element of the era is that the world is on the brink of nuclear war as political tensions in Eastern Europe grow more intense. But what's foremost on the mind of the retired heroes, however, is the recent murder of Edward Blake, known as the hero, the comedian. The vigilante Rorschach, a former hero who worked alongside Blake, takes notice of this murder and believes someone is trying to kill costumed heroes as part of a conspiracy. He decides to inform all his former hero associates of this plot, as well as interrogate former villains. Dan Dreiberg used to be known as the second iteration of the hero Night Owl, and was the closest with Rorschach when it came to crime fighting, but ultimately quit as he wasn't fit for the job, in more ways than one. Adrian Veidt was once the hero Ozymandias, the smartest man in the world, but he hung up his costume to pursue a line of business that included selling toys based on his hero identity. Dr. John Osterman was once a scientist, but due to an accident became the blue superhero Dr. Manhattan, a godlike being who is capable of perceiving his entire timeline. Laurie Juspexik, taking on the mantle of Silk Spectre after her mother retired the role, is now in a relationship with John and works alongside the American government. What we ultimately learn is that the person arranging the murders of both heroes and villains was Adrian. All of this was merely to keep secret his true plan of stopping the fears of nuclear annihilation. He plans to alleviate national tensions by putting things in perspective and sending a giant squid monster to New York City that will murder thousands of people. Everyone will think the creature is from another dimension and will rally together to protect themselves from a bigger threat. Adrian's plan works, and it leaves the other heroes with a fluctuating morality. Dan disagrees, but is too open and accepts Adrian's plan as the only reasonable route. John is the first to agree, given that he is also as egotistical and utilitarian in his views as Adrian. Laurie is so shocked by the events that she can't really do anything. Rorschach, however, believes the truth should be told and doesn't see any positives to this plan. When Rorschach refuses to protect the secret or lie about the events, he is killed by John. The comic book ends with Rorschach's journal detailing the truth behind these events. being discovered at the New Frontiersman publication. The comic proceeds in a non-linear fashion of jumping around in time to give us a bigger picture of what led to the events of 1985. We see how Blake went from being a costumed hero of moral ambiguity to a full-blown mercenary of ultra-nationalistic intent. We see the hero ensemble of the Minutemen and Watchmen not only disassembled based on conflicting political views, but how they were also deeply corrupt with hideous secrets. Perhaps the most intriguing storyline is that of John, whose life itself is nonlinear. He can see his own past and future all at the same time. As such, he spends a lot of time thinking about himself and how powerless he feels of his own destiny, despite wielding such godlike powers. In one of the most profound issues, each panel seems to cut to a different point in time in his mind that shifts from decades ago to just a few minutes ago. Many of these events repeat themselves over and over. Throughout the story, we take brief dives into the fictional comic book Tales of the Black Freighter, a pirate story of a protagonist committing acts of horrific violence and losing his mind in the process. Though we never see the full story as it is diced up between chapters, it becomes more clear as the story goes along that the Black Freighter is not only meant to be reflective of the events in the story, but also a prophetic vision of things to come. We also learn that the comic's writer, Max Shea, also play a role in Adrian's scheme, so the correlation is not quite a coincidence. These additions also help to add density to the story's more contemplative nature, for what Alan Moore described as a superhero Moby Dick. I think there's a misconception with such a comic book that's under the banner of DC Comics that there must be a hero in this story akin to Batman or Superman, considering Alan Moore wrote both characters. Here's the thing about that though. There is no hero we're supposed to root for in Watchmen. Let's address why with all the characters and start with the elephant in the room. Rorschach is considered by many to be the hero of the story. He's the one we follow the most, he gets the most done, and perhaps speaking the most volumes to this notion, he is posed as cool. He's the hard-edged hero who breaks all the rules and all the bones to make sure justice is served. While Rorschach is more or less a protagonist, he's not the hero. A lot of people today seem to have a problem with post-modernism to this degree of recognizing a film's central character as not someone to champion or idolize. As an example, Arthur Fleck is the protagonist of Joker, but he's not the hero. When he plunges the scissors into his coworker's neck and shoots a talk show host in the face, you're not supposed to be cheering for him, you fucking sociopath wearing a Joker t-shirt in the 6th row of the theater. Yeah, I saw you. Rorschach may be our point of view character in being the protagonist, but when looking at Rorschach's actions, he is not heroic. Consider the scene in a bar where he comes in looking for information. He hears some guy badmouth him, and Rorschach proceeds to break his fingers. He demands information, not from the man he's assaulting, but from everyone else, hoping they'll succumb to his cruelty and end the torture. But nobody knows anything, and so they merely plead with Rorschach to stop. As a result, Rorschach gets no information. He leaves the bar depressed and does not answer for his assault. This is not the mark of a hero. We even witness the very moment when Rorschach rejects all notion of justice and heroism in the scene where he confronts a child killer. Rather than arrest this murderer to answer for his crimes, Rorschach decides instead to flat out murder the man and his dogs when he finds out what's left of the kid. Now, to someone viewing this as nothing more than a brutal bit of Death Wish-style justice, someone may view this action as him being heroic. But I'm sorry, this is not heroic. Vigilantes always walk a fine line between breaking the law and serving justice. Whatever aspect of maintaining law and order was present within Rorschach before is all but gutted in that very scene. There's also a plethora of dialogue to go off of that suggests that Rorschach isn't in the right state of mind. He investigates everything, even stuff that shouldn't matter. At one point he mentions that Veidt may be a homosexual and that he needs to investigate this matter. Why is this important or relevant to the case in any way? Being on the wrong side of the law, he always breaks into houses when he either wants to chat or interrogate. Every time he breaks in, he always steals food, usually eating raw beans and eggs. He constantly speaks lowly of the world as being overstuffed with liberals, smooth talkers, whores, and sophisticated elites. You may also notice as the comic goes on that his dialogue becomes less eloquent, spoken with fewer and fewer words, and many times either mumbling them or just grunting. He also frequently reads the newspaper The New Frontiersman, which is spoken of as right-wing racist propaganda. We even see highlights of an issue that make this point very clear, as with one particular passage that essentially argues that the Ku Klux Klan had some great ideas about defending traditional American values. So, no, Rorschach is not a hero, and if you think he is, please re-examine your worldview. Now, Dan would seem like a more traditional hero, considering he believes in doing the right thing and by breaking as few laws and bones as possible. But he is also defeatist, meek, and has low self-esteem, both as a hero and as a man. He does not end up saving the day. He gives up. He bends on a whim so easily at the most horrible atrocities that his pals commit, be it Rorschach committing murderous acts or Adrian slaughtering most of New York City. He looks the other way on all of this. Lori is in a similar spot as Dan, making the two an easy enough coupling. She has perhaps the most human response to all the horrific actions of these heroes, but also feels the most helpless. Her reactions feel uncomfortably natural and understanding, especially for someone that has already gone through so much trauma. She's disgusted, not just by the actions of her vigilante associates, but how her former hero mother also looks back on history with rose-colored glasses. Adrian may be considered a hero in a grander sense of him preventing nuclear holocaust, but he did so at the cost of many lives. Right before Adrian delivers his reasoning for mass murder, he tells his murdered scientists a long story about how he essentially views himself as a man destined for greatness, because he went into the desert and had some visions while he was high. He bores his scientists to death, talking about how he sniffs his own farts, and that his farts are as great as Alexander the Great, so you should all be grateful that he's about to unleash the biggest fart of all time. Sorry. When Adrian's plan goes off without a hitch and the media eats up his story, he celebrates not by shouting that humanity is saved, but that he did it. Later on, he's not worried if humanity will make the right choices towards peace, but if he made the right call. In his last scene of the comic, he's still doing mental gymnastics to rationalize his actions. John essentially becomes a nihilist. His godlike powers that can manipulate matter and perceive all of time make him less human. By his very nature, he can't help but be an egotist. When he escapes to Mars to be alone with his thoughts, he is examining his own past. We view the relationships he had and the people he knew, but he views them in a light as more of an observer than a person affected by the presence of others. Everyone he knew means nothing to him. He has grown tired of this world and all the people in it. He has abandoned humanity. And the comedian? Well, I mean, do I really need to explain why the comedian's not a hero? He rapes and abuses women, he's a drunk, he's violent, he has unquestioning nationalistic tendencies, he has a nihilistic worldview, and he ruins the lives of both Silk Spectre and Lori. But just to be on the safe side, since people consider Rorschach a hero, let's address him anyway. Probably the one time someone would think that the comedian has a point was when he pointed out that John is losing his humanity. At a bar in Vietnam, just after winning the war, the comedian shoots a pregnant woman who attacked him, claiming that the baby was his. John pleaded to stop, but was unheard. The comedian, rather than regretting his actions, blames John for the incident, that John should have stopped such an altercation. Now, aside from the obvious of John being uncaring of human life, he was also giving the comedian a choice in that instance, trusting more in Blake's agency, even if indirectly, given that John has a strict adherence to the script he believes destiny has dealt him. But that's the problem with Blake. While John is certainly losing his humanity, the blame for such an incident does not rest on his will alone. Blake does not answer for his actions, and never views himself as wrong. it must be someone else's fault. He's not a hero. In fact, the comedian has more in common with the Joker, not merely for his funny man gimmick. He too believes that life is a joke and prefers to laugh at the idea of order than find a means of seeking it. And just like the Joker, this view is hypocritical as Blake works more explicitly with the American government for terrorizing protesters in his twilight years. The whole point of the comic book is to take a post-modernism approach to superheroes, to question their actions on a grander level past merely stopping the bad guy. But this bigger confusion with Watchmen, I believe, doesn't just stem from misreading the comic. It also comes from the starkly different interpretation of the story on the big screen. Watchmen had been in development hell for so many years, it was thought of to be the most unfilmable of comic books. Alan Moore stated about his work, quote, "I wanted to give comics a special place when I was writing things like Watchmen. I wanted to show off just what the possibilities of the comic book medium were, and films are completely different." He also went on to say that most of his work from the 80s onward was designed to be unfilmable, and yet several studios continued to plug away at making the Watchmen movie happen. Many of Alan Moore's comic books had been adapted for the big screen during this time, including From Hell, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and V for Vendetta. All of these films, however, had Moore's name removed from the credits, per his request. In fact, one of the only adaptations of his work that carries his name in the credits is an episode of Justice League Unlimited, which adapted his Superman story for The Man Who Has Everything. And even then, it appears that Moore only approved of the adaptation, and may not have truly liked it. The Watchmen movie would not receive such approval from Moore, and once you see the end result, you'll understand why. Since the comic book had finished its run, many directors were approached for a movie adaptation. Terry Gilliam was hired, but echoed Moore's sentiment that the story was unfilmable. David Hayter, Darren Aronofsky, and Paul Greengrass were all considered, but the project would be pushed back and canceled due to budgetary issues. After a long legal battle over copyright, directing duties for Watchmen eventually fell to Zack Snyder, a director first known for the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead, and was on the rise as a notable adapter of comic book properties. His work on bringing Frank Miller's overblown revisionist epic 300 to the big screen was visually striking and carried enough goofy machismo to feed the internet meme machine for a good 2 to 3 years. Snyder's take on Watchmen adheres faithfully to the structure and visuals of the book, but misses the bigger picture. A lot of what the film does right is when it stages scenes accurate to the comic, even reciting lines almost verbatim in a few scenes. It was essentially the same approach he took to 300 when it came to adapting a comic book for film, but all the positive aspects of this film are really just elements Snyder merely lifted from the original story. What he adds to the story is where things get lost. Consider how all the fight scenes are staged in that trademark Snyder slow motion. There's a lot of brutality and destruction. The very first scene features Blake, played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, punching a chunk of his wall and then driving his fist through another wall. Is this really the same depressed and aged drunk of the comic book? Everything in the film just looks too slick. Night Owl, portrayed by Patrick Wilson, doesn't feel like an overweight and over-the-hill hero. He looks as buff and dynamic as any modern superhero. Rorschach, played by Jackie Earle Haley, isn't portrayed as depressed or flawed, but gritty and cool, appearing more like the 1980s anti-hero, which the comic book more felt like it was trying to deconstruct rather than celebrate. There's also a grandness and operatic sense to the direction that makes the film come off almost like an overblown work of Shakespeare. Every line of dialogue is delivered in a tone so serious it borders on comical for how dark this film takes itself. It's as though Snyder is trying to amp up every ounce of angst so that the audience isn't snickering too much at Dr. Manhattan's bouncing blue penis on screen. But if this was the goal, the soundtrack choices don't help. As in the scene of Adrian at his office with Everybody Wants to Rule the World from Tears for Fear playing in the background. I mean, you get it? Because he wants to rule the world? Yeah. Some of the choices are odd. The sex scene between Dan and Lori and the owl ship was a little silly in the comic book with the capper of the flamethrower upon climax, but when paired with Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, it's more ridiculous than passionate. Worth noting is that Snyder had originally intended to use an Alison Krauss song, but decided to reject that idea as the music made the scene, quote, too romantic and too sexy. Yep, wouldn't want to depict the one genuine moment of passionate sex in the story as romantic or sexy, would we? And then there are choices that are just downright inappropriate. When John goes on a killing spree in the battlefields of Vietnam, it's set to the Budapest Symphony Orchestra playing Ride of the Valkyries. Yeah, this scene doesn't work. I get that Snyder is trying to go for the whole juxtaposed war showcase, but it's a bit that is both played out and done far better in other films. There are a few narrative changes here and there, but easily the biggest change to the picture was the ending that differs greatly from the comic book. Rather than transporting a giant squid monster to New York City, Adrian's plan in the movie is to use Dr. Manhattan's power to set off a bomb, placing the blame on Dr. Manhattan. This is staged in a manner that Manhattan is convinced this is the right call, and decides to leave Earth forever. But this sets off a chain reaction of an ending that comes off more hokey than bitter. Instead of John leaving Veidt unsure about pondering the future, opting to leave Earth behind more out of the tedium for the life already present, John instead gives a romantic farewell to Lori by giving her one last kiss before he departs. Before he does that, however, he must first deal with Rorschach, who doesn't die alone in the cold, but with Night Owl watching and screaming in dismay, in an attempt to add more drama to the situation. And then everyone just leaves, like, awkwardly. It should be easy to see why this ending feels lacking. Rorschach's death is more theatrical than chilling, Manhattan's departure is more touching than uneasy, the lack of Lori and Dan having sex immediately in Veidt's place removes an agency for their humanity, and Veidt just kind of feels good about winning, not really harboring any fears about the future or his morality that he tried to fight in the comic. Snyder's Watchmen encapsulates the director's biggest problem when it comes to placing comic books on the big screen. When it comes to matching frames and dialogue, he's faithful on a surface level, but any greater deconstruction within the text feels lost in his stylish edge. You can see this lacking nature within his 2016 film Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. The title fight lifts its imagery from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, but lacks the greater thematic elements of the opposing views on justice, which is strange considering how explicit that comic is in its messaging. Snyder misses a lot of these important aspects of Watchmen that creates a film more aloof in its greater message that can be almost entirely missed by most mainstream audiences. Film adaptations often change a lot from their source material, but it can sometimes be understandable if the greater message and tone is present. Watchmen isn't a flawed film because it didn't include this scene or rewrote that scene. It's that its very core message and atmosphere misses the bigger picture of portraying comic book heroes as flawed individuals of ambiguous morality. This is especially true when considering there was an ultimate cut of Watchmen, which not only included more scenes from the comic, but even inserted tales of the Black Freighter in as well. And yet with all of this, with all this faithfulness and frames and dialogue, it still feels off and doesn't carry the same impact as its source material. It's mostly all there, and yet it doesn't feel the same. But more than that, I think a big problem with making a Watchmen movie in 2009 is that by its very design, it can't hold the appeal of the era. Watchmen felt topical because it tapped into the times of the 1980s and was made to feel relevant and scary for how real it felt. Now that we've survived the era of fearing nukes every day, this kind of story seems too retro and more throwbackish than meaningful. This could be the reasoning why Snyder made so many changes to make the film more appealing on a different level. But if you have to go that far to retool Watchmen for modern audiences while still trying to recapture the text, then it just seems that Alan Moore's declaration that Watchmen was unfilmable is all the more true. When word broke of a Watchmen TV series being in development, I wasn't exactly enthused about the news. After the Watchmen movie and prequel comic books that never quite grasped the appeal of the acclaimed comic book, my hopes for an attempt at a TV series being good were fairly low, even with someone as experienced as Damon Lindelof at the helm. Lindelof's credits include writing on Lost and most recently working on HBO's previously stellar show The Leftovers. But to my surprise, the show is great. Seriously, it's some of the best television I've seen in the last decade. The show makes itself clear that this is intended to be a sequel to the comic book and not the movie, made evident by the referencing of a squid attack on New York in 1985. In this version of 2019, Robert Redford has taken the office of presidency. Under his order, reparations are made out to families of the persecuted, referred to as Redfordations. Since this act, we see that there are now more black families amid the suburban settings. The Redfordations, however, also led to a backlash and a rise in white nationalism with the formation of the 7th Cavalry. Since the cavalry have become more violent in their actions, namely against cops, the law enforcement is now much different. Costume heroes now have become a common rank among the police, the concealment of identity better protecting police officers and their families. Some choose themes, while others just settle for basic coverings of the face. A key detective we follow throughout is Angela Abar, donning the identity of the masked Sister Knight when on duty. She's the most intriguing character given that she has a personal stake in stopping the cavalry, and a shadowy past that she's terrified to confront. But she'll have to seek the awful truth of what brought her to this point, as it's constantly staring her in the face. For example, her costume that incorporates a nun's habit is based on an action hero she idolized as a young girl, which plays into her own worldview of criminal justice. There are a few other costume heroes on the force that are mostly gimmicks, such as Red Scare, Pirate Jenny, and Panda. The only other employed hero we follow more closely is Wade Tillman, aka Looking Glass. His costume also comes from the trauma of his past, as it's revealed he was present in New York during the squid attack of 1985, specifically in a hall of mirrors at a carnival. Since that event, he becomes more terrified of beings from other dimensions entering our own, leading to him adopting a reflective mask which is said to have properties of blocking out interdimensional disturbances. He also arms himself with a security system that has assurances of preventing any dimensional portals from opening, and he also attends a group of similarly traumatized people. Though we know from the comic book the squid being interdimensional was a hoax, Wade and nearly the entire population of Earth continue to believe this narrative because Adrian has rigged more squids to be interdimensionally transported. Not big ones though, just little baby ones that are about as troublesome as hail, but still just enough of a reminder that Earth is under constant squid watch. Looking Glass is akin to Rorschach in that he had a traumatic experience in his youth that shaped his view of the world. The key difference being that while Rorschach took the offensive with his paranoia, Looking Glass goes on the defensive, choosing to prepare and defend rather than go out looking for trouble and seeking a means of stopping the hidden evil. It's a smart call considering he later learns the truth about the giant squid never being a dimensional monster, and chooses to channel that hoax-crafted fear into something more meaningful, that restores the world he feels has wronged him, rather than destroy it. The newest billionaire on the block is Lady True, the CEO of True Industries. Similar to Adrian, she is extremely intelligent and has a scientific plan that she believes will fix the world, choosing to keep her mastermind tendencies a supreme secret. The similarities to Adrian are no coincidence, as we later learn that she was the result of a maid that artificially inseminated herself with Adrian's sperm. The maid did this action less out of wanting a baby and more as a "f*** you" to Adrian. I mean, like, she literally says this while she's shooting the sperm inside her. True takes a path similar to Adrian as that of spite and egotism. When she first comes to Adrian to admit that she's his daughter and that she needs some money, she was denied this request and has since grown up seeking to prove herself to her father and attain the power he believes she has earned. And speaking of Adrian, there are a few familiar characters who return from the comic. Adrian Veidt, aka Ozymandias, unsure that he'd ever see a utopia of his own creation, embraced John's custom paradise on Europa of a country manor. Veidt's years of seclusion have left him unfulfilled, even with an endless supply of homegrown human puppets that he can bend to his whim to either reenact his favorite moments of Earth, or just play a game of trying to outsmart a dastardly villain. He really loves cake, and spends nearly his entire time trying to devise a means of escape from what he believed was what he wanted all along. He also entertains a trial of being tried for his crimes just so he can literally unleash a fart on all of them. Because, like I said, he enjoys sniffing his own farts, because he thinks his farts are as profound as Alexander the Great, so everyone should be grateful for his farts. You see, I wasn't just blowing smoke up your ass when I mentioned the whole farting thing. John, aka Dr. Manhattan, we learn has been in a similar state of exile. While he does make good on his words to Adrian about going off to create new life, he soon tires of the experience and returns to Earth in 2009. He formed a new romantic bond with Angela, but desiring not to make the same mistakes again, he opts to have his mind erased and assume the identity of Angela's husband. Of course, when things go from bad to worse, Angela awakens him from his paradise coma, and his power becomes a central desire of the story. Laurie, aka Silk Spectre 2, now works as an FBI agent. Dan is currently in prison, so their relationship is pretty much done, but she still hasn't gotten over John. She constantly tries to reach out to him via a phone that can supposedly contact him, but there is no answer. Oh, and she also needs blue dildos to satisfy herself now. Having grown bitter by superheroes over the years, she now aims to curb vigilantism even more, and has extra scrutiny when handling the masked cops that choose themes. She also works alongside FBI agent Petey, a comic nerd surrogate of sorts. Worth noting is that Laurie is now more keen to embrace her identity rather than hide it, changing her name to Laurie Blake, named after her true father. One character who we learn far more about is the hero Hooded Justice, a fairly mysterious figure of the comic book. He was a more prominent member of the old days of costumed heroes, but also very secretive. Nobody ever discovered his true identity when he retired, though Hollis Mason believed it may have been that of a bodybuilder that mysteriously vanished. We don't know too much about his personality, but it is mentioned in the comic that Hooded Justice at one point expressed approval of Hitler's Third Reich. So all we really had to go on with him was that he kept his identity secret and that he may be a Nazi in the closet. The series takes particular fascination with this hero. In the superhero docudramas that are seen on television, we see a few rumors about the hero, such as him being a white man and a closeted homosexual who had Captain Metropolis as a lover. The truth reveals that Hooded Justice was indeed gay, but his true identity was that of the black man Will, the grandfather of Angela. This makes his history exceptionally muddy, considering he was a husband, father, and cop before he became a hero, and his life crumbled into secrecy and obscurity. Will's backstory makes for one of the arguably best episodes of the series, This Extraordinary Being. It's a great episode in that we learn the truth about Will, a man who essentially has to put on two masks with Hooded Justice, one of a white man and one of the Hood. It's also stellar because it reveals more of the sinister plot behind the white supremacist group who we later come to know as Cyclops, using the hypnosis of movies to hypnotize black people and advance their racist hold on society. It's perhaps one of the boldest attempts I've seen of any show to stress how much media conceptions shape our worldview, in a manner that seems both blunt and subtle at the same time. I think what's especially unique about this episode is that Angela is witness to this entire flashback of events by ingesting a nostalgia drug, where she drops in and out of the situation of the times. It's a visual staging that drives home the point that a certain stigma never really goes away no matter how much we try to bury it. Angela is in the exact same scenario as Will, and has to question carefully which move she'll make next to avoid repeating the errors of the past. This isn't easy because Will's story is complicated and frustrating. There's no one thing within his story that you can point to and say, "Oh, I won't do that." It's a far bigger problem, and her deep reflection on history gives her, at the very least, a slightly clearer roadmap for how to reshape her own world. And those are pretty much all of the primary characters. Oh no, wait, I'm sorry. I completely forgot about Lube Man. Oh yes, there's Lube Man. This mysterious masked vigilante is only present in one scene, in one episode, and has no dialogue. He witnesses Angela's actions of disposing of evidence, flees the scene, covers himself in oil, and makes a quick escape into the sewers. His appearance was so strange and mysterious. Now, of course, if you read through the bonus text in the marketing resource of the PDpedia, it's revealed quite clearly that Lube Man is FBI agent Dale Petey. This information isn't a requirement to understand the story, it's just kind of a fun little Easter egg. Maintaining a non-linear format, the show jumps all around in time. Interestingly enough, the show actually begins at its earliest point in the timeline, where the spark of heroism was lit. The first episode starts off by depicting the 1921 Tulsa Massacre on what was known as Black Wall Street, bringing to light a horrific incident in American history that is not as well remembered. This is where Will, as a boy, would learn firsthand what it means to be a hero in chaotic times. From there, the show jumps all over the place. We see the rise of the Minutemen and the supposed golden age of heroes. We relive the horrific events of 1985 that turned New York City into a bloodbath. We follow the chaotic occupation of Vietnam, where Dr. Manhattan was both praised and hated for his conquering of the country. And we see the aftermath of all the events in the comic in various years that built the characters up to their troubled selves in 2019. Production-wise, I gotta mention how amazing this show looks. It's astounding how much world building this show does, always presented with a perfect atmosphere of tension, weirdness, and uneasiness. Also, the soundtrack by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross just kicks ass. Okay, seriously, I've been listening to this music for like most of the time that I've been editing this video, and I'm seriously considering risking demonetization just so I could play a little bit of the music. I mean, it's that good. Watchmen touches on a lot of weighty subjects, from racism to criminal justice, to nostalgia, to fascism, to colonialism, to existentialism, to questioning heritage. There's also a deep questioning of anonymity in both the heroes and villains that wear masks. Both are portrayed in the show as having considerable power by never revealing themselves. But Will's words ultimately make the point clear about this problem. You can't always heal under a mask. Wounds need air. We can't keep lying for the supposed good of the world or hiding behind comforting and impenetrable walls, not if we want to grow and fix problems with the world. A major criticism for some of this show is that it feels too political for tackling the subject of racism and fascism. Some have criticized that a focus more in line with current social issues disrespects the original. Yet when taking the comic book into account with the era in which it was conceived, shifting the focus of Watchmen to current political elements is the most Watchmen thing that the series does, while at the same time also making the show its own unique entity. The original comic book was deeply reflective of the time, with concerns about nuclear annihilation as tensions flared around nations wielding the power of atomic bombs during the Cold War. This aspect wasn't just a genre ingredient of the times, it was a real fear. The fear protruded into all aspects of media, where numerous films, TV series, and TV specials approach this difficult and frightening topic. A fear of fascism and nationalism in general has become a part of current events, and thus a relatable means of shifting the politics to something more modern. Along those same lines, many may believe the show tarnishes the legacy of Rorschach, with the 7th Cavalry adopting his mask as a symbol for their white nationalism. To those believing that Rorschach was not a guy who was that bad, I urge you to reread the comic, specifically the New Frontiersman excerpt, which confirms that Rorschach's literature of choice, as well as the paper that celebrated him the most, made the argument for the Ku Klux Klan. The comic book ended with the New Frontiersman receiving Rorschach's diary, filled with all his dark thoughts about how he perceived justice, and his cynical view of the world which he believed must be cleansed. It's not exactly the biggest stretch to imagine that somewhere along the way, his diary, in the hands of such propagandists as the New Frontiersman, could be seen by white nationalists as a rally cry, a beacon to cling towards, a symbol for their group to seem more powerful and intimidating. Their warning video with a speech about black filth and liberal tears is not too far off from the ramblings of Rorschach, albeit twisted more for racism than crime fighting. It's a fine line, isn't it? The white nationalist idolizing Rorschach wasn't some left-field twist. It was a seed that the character planted, even if by accident. Given that the show slowly came out, the initial perception of the first few episodes make it sound like a left-leaning utopia, where a Democrat celebrity is president, reparations are paid for, television programs come with nearly a full minute of trigger warnings, and cops have heavier restrictions on firearms. But even with all this, it still doesn't make the world out to be utopian. False utopian maybe, but not straight utopia. It still has all the same problems as before, where the most rich and powerful still control the room. There's still violence in the street, racial tensions, and genocide abound. I think what's most remarkable about this show is that it never presents Angela as the perfect hero. If you were only to watch the first episode and then, I don't know, make a reactionary response, you might make the mistake in this prejudgment. But watch the show further, and you'll see that Angela starts questioning everything. The system she serves, her supposed concept of justice, the history behind the current justice system, and whether or not she can do anything about the system. In the first episode, she's gleeful about taking down white supremacists at their hideout, but in the next episode, where her unit rushes a trailer park and beats back on rednecks, doubts start to grow within her if such aggression will accomplish anything. It's a battle she faces throughout the show as she comes face to face, not just with her lineage, but the very nature of justice and how fragilely it can be mutated when driven by revenge. She witnesses history repeat itself before her very eyes with Lady True. Though Lady True is ultimately against the white nationalists of the 7th Cavalry and Cyclops, she aims to do so with both the egotism of Adrian and the power of Dr. Manhattan. She even murders the white supremacists by unceremoniously vaporizing them in the same way Dr. Manhattan silenced Rorschach. But, as we've seen in this show, it's going to take more than merely obliterating the enemy to fix the bigger issues. And then there's the complaint about making Dr. Manhattan black, which is kinda hilarious considering this is literally the only character in all of Watchmen who can change the color of his skin, and literally does so in the original comic book. But what's really great about this choice is that even the show points out this shifting as being iffy, where Adrian tells the transformed John that taking on a new skin color is both cultural appropriation and a little problematic in the 21st century. The show builds not just on the events of the comic, but takes a unique pendulum swing of the structure. The comic book questioned the notion of heroes and their actions, highlighting how their power is something frightening and uncontrollable. They could use that power to do good, but when it's on a massive scale and via a utilitarian philosophy with egotistical leanings, it seems like their morality is secondary to the power they weave. The likes of Adrian and John seem like unstoppable forces, and whether they have good intentions or not doesn't matter. They control everything. The TV series suggests that such power is not without weakness, that there's still a humanizing element to them. By the end of the show, both Adrian and John are defeated. Their power is not left unchecked or allowed to run rampant. It is both destroyed by the evil and prosecuted by the noble. There's no guarantee by the end of the show, however, that everything will be better if these villains are brought down. We don't know for sure if Dr. Manhattan's power is truly gone, and we don't know if Adrian will be fully prosecuted for his crimes against humanity. But that's kind of the point. There's no guarantee that the future will be bright. Adrian already tried to do that, and if the smartest man in the world can't make the future a better place, what hope do we have? And that, I believe, is what the show amplifies most. It rejects the notion that in order to bring change and do good in the world, that you must either be among the elite or an all-powerful Superman to make a dent. As long as we can take off the masks and learn from our past mistakes, we can be better people and make a better world. But what's perhaps the most remarkable thing about this show is how it drew attention to the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, which is a bit of a buried piece of American history. On Memorial Day, on Black Wall Street, 19-year-old black man Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a 17-year-old white woman. When he was taken into custody, a race riot soon started as angry whites and angry blacks clashed outside the courthouse. The violence spread throughout the town, and soon the National Guard was called in to institute martial law, including using air support. The massacre resulted in many deaths and much destruction of the town. For such a large-scale massacre, the event has been referred to as the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. Now, if you've never heard of this event, relax, you're not alone. For the longest time, it was covered up. Survivors and residents were quiet about it. Historical records were mostly omitted, and many grew up since those events, having never known of the massacre. It wouldn't be until 1996 when a committee was formed to better look into the Tulsa massacre. What they found was a disturbing connection of the city encouraging the whites against the blacks of Greenwood. Soon after this committee made its findings in a 2001 report, legislation finally went forward to make amends for the atrocities of the Tulsa massacre. The state enacted scholarships for the descendants of the victims, took measures to improve the economic growth for the Greenwood district, and even built a memorial. Not only is the discovery of the Tulsa massacre a fairly new development, but there's still news about it coming out. Around the same time that Watchmen had aired, a discovery had been made in Tulsa of a pit that may have been an unmarked grave for several victims of the massacre. This is perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Watchmen series that is playing out in our own time, that we haven't uncovered all of history when the secrets are still buried by the malicious nature of the past. Sometimes it's up to the next generation to not only learn from the mistakes of the past, but seek them out as well. The show ends ambiguously with Angela believing John had passed his powers onto her, and cuts right before she attempts to walk on water. Some would say this is just a cliffhanger for the next season, but that doesn't appear to be the case, as the second season doesn't appear to be something showrunner Lindelhof wants to pursue. One season and the show is done. But honestly, that's fine. The final scene is the best note to go out on, and it's not some unfulfilled tease as many would believe. It leaves the lingering question of how the future will play out, if Angela has the power to deeply change the world, both in terms of John's powers and her own philosophy of justice. If she does happen to have John's powers, what will she do with them? Use it for good or evil? Will she mistakenly repeat the failures of the past or learn from them? She and we do not know this, but she'll never know the answer until she is confident enough to take that first step forward, with the very real possibility that she'll fall. If the Watchmen series is to end on that shot, it's honestly perfect. Before I close out this video, I know I skipped over the Watchmen prequel comics and the more recent crossover comic event. I tried to read them and they're just bad. So yeah, I'm not going to be talking about those. Read them at your own discretion.